So between 1817 and 1920, 72 million people died around the world from pandemics of cholera, plague, and influenza. Of those, 40 million died in India alone. And yet we don't remember those times. It's almost as if our public memories of these events that meant so much to our great and great-great-grandparents have been wiped clean. In this new book, Chinmay Tumbe has put together an encyclopedic and rich account of what happened during the age of pandemics. Chinmay teaches at the Indian Institute of Management in Ahmedabad. He studied at the London School of Economics and Political Science, the Indian Institute of Management in Bangalore, Ria College in Mumbai, and he got a start at Rishi Valley School. In 2013, he was a fellow at the European University Institute in Florence, and in 2018, a visiting scholar at Harvard Business School in Boston. His first book was India Moving, A History of Migration. This is his second book. This talk is organized by Champaca. It's an independent, women-run bookstore, children's library, and cafe. They bring diverse stories and perspectives for their readers and in their children's library through their books and events. They run a small cafe for the community to spend a few quiet hours with a book and a coffee. And this book is available on their website, www.champaca.in, and it ships across India. And I'm your host, Gayathri Vaidhyanathan. I'm a journalist and co-host of a podcast called Scrolls and Leaves. It's an immersive, sound-rich podcast that we hope makes the past come alive. We feature stories from the margins of history, science, and cultures. And our first episode, incidentally, was on ancient pandemics. Check it out with your headphones on if possible at www.scrollsandleaves.com or wherever you get your podcasts. And finally, a bit about the format today. We'll talk for roughly 25 minutes and then take questions from the audience. You can type them in the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. Okay, so onward to the book. Chinmay, let's start with where you wrote the book, which is on the beautiful IIM campus in Ahmedabad and the Vikram Sarabhai Library. Writers and researchers often have a village of people who support, and you've dedicated your book to librarian Anilkumar. Can you tell us about him?
Yeah, this book is dedicated to a librarian, which I think, given that it's going to go to a fair amount of libraries. And Anil was a good friend of mine. Unfortunately, passed away young last year on his birthday in July in 2020. And his sort of passing away left a huge void in our community because he had done so much to really reshape the library into the 21st century over the last 2 decades at IMA. The Vikram Sarabhai Library today is without a doubt one of the greatest libraries in the world, actually. Structurally beautiful, the Louis Kahn architecture. When you go inside, it's a pleasure to be there. And he, thanks to Anil, he understood very quickly that we are going digital. And so while there are, of course, books, he's made it very interactive. And so as you enter the library, you really want to, be there. And it's very inspiring. And the library staff is absolutely outstanding. They are so helpful. For this book would simply have not been possible, without this outstanding library support. I would just send in them emails saying I want this, and within a few hours I would have that resource. And so that is why not only is the library such an important part of this book's journey, but Anil, as a dear friend, and his passing away also brought home the reality of the pandemic, and that is why this book is actually dedicated in memory of Dr. Anilkumar.
Just in terms of securing material for doing research on this amazing book, did you find it difficult due to COVID-19?
Yeah, I mean, there are certain things, obviously, I would love to have gone to the National Archives of India and seen some more material and so on. And I'm continuing my research now. A few months before the lockdown, I was in Nagpur, where you have the Vidarbha Central Archives, and Central India was hugely devastated by the influenza pandemic. And I'd seen some files on health. And so I'm continuing that research even after the book. But yes, so there was no access to archives in India. But luckily, the Wellcome Collection, the National Library of Scotland, they've digitized a huge amount of old reports and a lot of important material and kept it freely available online. So in a sense, some of the key historical sources on the 19th century pandemics on India in particular were available online. And that drastically, and it sort of reduced the transaction costs of doing research. I also got very lucky in terms of variety of other resources that came up during this book, but of course challenging in the sense that you can't just go to people. Otherwise, I would call friends in different cities and say, "Can you check this in a library?" I could obviously not do that. So it was thanks to our library securing as much as it could be possible from other libraries in the world in terms of other papers and so on. Thanks to the Wellcome Collection, thanks to I think the National Library of Scotland. There's I think the University of Glasgow, Edinburgh, they have this PhD thesis of or MD thesis of Harriet. It's a rare account of a doctor describing the influenza pandemic in Punjab, and it's freely available online. So definitely digital sources help the book project. Could it have been better? Of course, but I also had this thing that I wanted the book out in 2020, and so I was pushing myself further. So
a shout out to libraries. So just going into the book a bit, India before 1817, there were outbreaks of disease before that, but the loss of life wasn't catastrophic, I think. So what changed in the 1800s?
I think mortality was always high around the world, right? Before the, say, late 19th century, where for the first time systematically mortality is reduced in, say, UK, Western Europe, and so on. But across, human history is a saga of very high mortality rates. Death rates of about 30 per thousand, or 3% of the population gets knocked out every year. And today that number is less than about 0.5% or so. So that's a huge, tremendous revolution that's happened around the world over the last 100 years. But in India, actually, after 1817, when this new strain of cholera travels around the world, it kind of devastates the Indian subcontinent in particular. It of course affects Egypt, cholera devastates Egypt. It hits Russia. So the pockets of the world. It's not that all of the world was hit throughout at equal intensity, but the Indian subcontinent in particular was badly hit. And to make matters worse, in the late 19th and early 20th century, India was hit by three massive droughts. This is 1877, 1899, and 1980. And these droughts were the worst rainfall sort of occurrences recorded in Indian history. So since 1918, we've never had such bad rainfall in recorded time. So it was unusual. The climatic phenomenon was unusual. The disease environment was unusual because of these new strains. Remember, plague has always been there in India, but again, plague came back in the late 19th century, and it combined with all these other things: a drought, the globalization, people moving all across the subcontinent, the railways, the telegraph, the steamships, and so this overall mobility, interacting with new strains of bacteria and viruses, interacting with bad weather patterns, kind of the perfect storm in which about 40 million Indians died. And about 70 million people across the world died in this century.
So I'm just going to set the scene very briefly. In 1817, cholera begins in Jeshur in Bengal, and then year by year it marches around the world, and it's devastating, and it becomes known as Indian cholera or Asiatic cholera. Indians are seen as carriers of disease. So can you tell us how Indians dealt with the disease that they didn't know much about, scientifically speaking?
Yeah, cholera was, of course, known earlier. It was not like the coronavirus, which is certainly very new. It was, people had words for cholera. It was known as Hyza, for example. Yet the strain that was there in 1870 is arguably, it was much more virulent and much more lethal. The traditional norms to deal with it was a pinch of opium and a pinch of calomel, as the British would call it. Mercurius chloride. And of course, Indians, different medical systems had different, hing is a classic ingredient in many, in cooking in India, but also it has medicinal properties. So variety of sort of herbal, solutions. Now, were they effective? It's tough to say, but it's unlikely that they were very effective, but they must have, given some sort of mental solace. And people, all I would say is that in the early 19th century, when this is happening, there is no real advantage of Western science. Western medicine science is about as weak or ineffective as the traditional knowledge systems in India. And so people are really grappling in the dark. And even in Europe, in the story of cholera before 1850s is that people are just clueless. There's a sort of picture in my book, a comic strip in the, which denotes this person wrapped up in a lot of clothes with a lot of books on cholera, kind of showing the complete uselessness of advice given on cholera. So that's how mysterious this disease is. In fact, people are also suggesting bloodletting, which people would now say is the complete opposite, because cholera is all about dehydration. And so the solution is eventually rehydration, which emerges in the 20th century. But when you're dehydration, when you're dehydrating, when people are taking blood off your body, that's the worst thing that can happen. And yet people are obsessed about such theories. In one classic example, in India, they started this practice, the British, of having leeches placed, on the anus to suck out the blood. So really bizarre practices which emerged in this period. And as one reviewer said, it was pretty much nothing. It can be characterized, the first 30 years of trying to understand this new cholera can be called the doctor's solution was nothing but benevolent homicide. And that is a sort of a characterization of cholera. So it's really in the 1850s that people get to understand how to contain it, and it's really only in the 20th century that people understand how to cure it. One is prevention, and then the cure comes much later. So it's a very, as a historical narrative, it has a series of disasters in not only the presence of the disease, but also in the scientific discoveries, the scientific theories. Everyone has their own pet theory on cholera.
And what happens after the 1850s? I mean, so in Europe, the scientists figure out it's tied to dirty water and they fix their sanitation. But what do the Brits in India do about it? Do they also think that in India it's tied to dirty water?
Yeah, the real culprit seems to be a guy called Max von Pettenkofer, who's a hero in Germany. And Pettenkofer is this guy who's treated as a hero because he overhauled the sanitation system in Germany and so on. And he's credited for a lot of improvement of public health system, public hygiene. But this is the big difference. For about 2,000 years, medical systems around the world thought of air, miasma, or these impure air as the carriers of disease. And so if you had cleanliness, it was good. It was a check against epidemics. Vis-a-vis some guy like John Snow who says, cholera is waterborne, so you need to focus on water. Or people talking like Louis Pasteur and Robert Koch at the end of the 19th century saying germ-based theories. And these are completely new revolutionary ideas, which is completely alien for Max von Pettenkofer. Even someone like Florence Nightingale, who wrote a lot on India, who was very concerned about sanitation hygiene, she was convinced that diseases are essentially atmospheric in nature. And it's only in the 1890s when she was shown a microscope and say, look, this is what causes disease, that she started to change her mind. But nothing could change Max von Pettenkofer. And it turns out that a lot of the Indian medical service people looked up to this guy. And so for about literally 50 years after it was understood that cholera is waterborne, there's a sort of steep scientific paradigm in which the Indian medical service officers were adhering to, that cholera is not waterborne. And they had their own reasons, because they saw cholera was seasonal. They saw cholera, it did seem that there were some environmental factors based on their observation, because remember, cholera was endemic in at least Eastern India. So they couldn't understand why, if cholera was always there, what John Snow was saying did not make too much sense. So they had their own set of reasons, but it turned out it was quite wrong. And it's really only in the 1900s or 1910s when they abandoned this theory. And there are officers also in India, British officers, a guy called M.C. Fernell, who says, no, he writes a pamphlet called Cholera and Water in India, arguing to his seniors that, look, cholera is a waterborne disease. And by some accounts, he's dismissed for questioning the orthodoxy. So it's a very unfortunate tale that while UK, England, and Western Europe had, or even the USA, had kind of conquered cholera by 1860s. It ravaged Russia, it ravaged Egypt, it ravaged much of Asia actually, because people did not quite get the gravity of the situation, that it was essentially waterborne. And if you got piped water into your houses, if you had filtration processes, you could actually cut down cholera intensity. So again, this cholera is very interesting because it shows you how even in science, because these medical service people were also, they looked at themselves as scientists. And many of these guys, by the way, in the Indian medical service won Nobel Prizes. Like, Ronald Ross won the Nobel Prize for understanding malaria. And then there's this one more person. There's also, a person like Leonard Rogers, who finally actually discovers how to treat cholera, which is the intravenous method. And so he kind of salvages the reputation of the Indian medical service, because until then it's a complete disaster. And it's only from the 1910s that, thanks to this guy's understanding of how to treat cholera, that cholera starts receding.
So you mentioned MC Fernald, and I wanted to ask you about this map that you have in the book of the cholera map of this little village in Madras presidency, I think. Can you tell us about that a bit? Like, what is this map and what did it show?
So this is a village in what we now call as Tamil Nadu, the state in the south. And John Snow had this famous map. It's taught in courses around the world. In fact, I start my course on urban studies also with this map. To understand, John Snow basically famously showed a street map of London and said this cholera is waterborne because a lot of deaths happen around a particular what's known as the Broad Street pump. And interestingly, when I was doing the research for this book, I found that even there were maps being used in India. And MC Fernald, in this pamphlet, actually has this very neat map of a village in South India, where he shows there's a street, and one side of the street is all the so-called upper caste, and on the other side of the street is so-called lower caste. And in the sense, this is perfect caste-based residential segregation. Now, it so happened that the wells of that village were on the side of the upper caste. So he has this, well number A and well number B mentioned on this map. And on the other side, he has no well, and the other, it's inferred that the water source for the other guys is outside the village. And it just so happened that this village, the only people who suffer from cholera are the so-called upper caste. And he argues that this because the wells were contaminated, and because there's such a strict segregation of water sources, nobody from this side gets cholera because they're drinking water from a completely different source, which is fascinating to tell you how strict the segregation was. And the one person who did get cholera from the other side was the washerman of these guys. So again, the connection, water. He says the two wells, and the one guy who got it was the washerman. It was almost like a classic experiment. So it is really fascinating that MC Fernald was using very Jon Snowish kind of method, and also tells you a lot about India's caste system, and how in this case actually the upper caste were getting affected more. But on average, we know that the numbers are very clear. The lower caste were in general much poorer, were devastated in these pandemics. Mortality rates later on in plague, influenza, when they started seeing caste-wise, there was something like 3 or 5, sometimes even 10 times higher death rates as you go down the social ladder. But in this particular case, what Fernald was showing was that actually the upper caste were more affected because of the contaminated wells.
And you mentioned he's dismissed, right, for trying to challenge
again, I think it's more of the realm of speculation, because I've taken it from one source, but again, I would like to see more sources on this dismissal. So I'm not fully convinced of that. But yeah.
So just to recap, by 1920, cholera claims 8 million lives in India. And then in 1894, there's a new disease on the scene, plague, and that's carried by rats on ships from Hong Kong. And thousands of sick people in Maharashtra are taken to quarantine camps. And you write about this memoir, Smriti Chitra, by Lakshmibai Tilak. Can you tell us about her and what she experiences in these camps?
Yeah, Lakshmibai Tilak, a remarkable woman. She wrote an autobiography in Marathi in the 1930s, which was translated recently by this distinguished writer Shanta Gokhale about 3 years back. So it's a very recent English translation. And it's very interesting, this whole story, because I met Shanta Gokhale 2 years back at a literature festival. And I just picked up the book literally to get her autograph. I had no intention of ever reading Smriti Chitra because, now I know it's a great book. And so, I've read it. But it has been lying on my bookshelf for 2 years only because I wanted the autograph of, Shanta Gokhale. And while I was doing research, in my office, spending long nights in my office, I really wanted first-person accounts in this book. And because, I'm trained as an economist, I know the numbers. I had created a massive mortality statistics database from 1870 to 1940. I knew exactly which parts of India were affected. And a lot of that is reflected in the book. And yet, I said to myself, there have to be first-person accounts. Anybody who lived through this period must have written something about this. And I was just looking at my shelf and said, who lived through this time? And I said, then there was, Smriti Chitra looking back at me. And because she lived in the late 19th and early 20th century. And so I started flipping through Smriti Chitra. And unbelievably, there's a whole account of plague. And so I got that account in the plague chapter on quarantine camps. But then even unknown to Shanta Gokhale, and maybe even unknown to Lakshmibai Tilak, who wrote the book and accounts, what she had described as a disease called Manmodi was nothing but what we'd call as today as the Spanish flu or the influenza pandemic of 1918. And it followed, there was first a massive drought, there was despair, and then the flu came and just wiped out, literally hundreds of thousands of people. And she calls it Manmodi, and Shanta Gokhale translated as Manmodi. And I recently got in touch with Shanta Gokhale saying, I don't think you realize, but what you were actually describing and while translating was nothing but the great 1918 pandemic. And she was so thrilled because she said that I did so much research to find out what this word Manmodi means. And we now know from other studies that Manmodi was used in Marathi and many other language, sort of tribal communities in Western India to describe the flu. And so this was a great account, first-person account. And she said stuff like, there was so much despair, people traded a cow for 2 pomegranates. Very vivid descriptions of how much of the despair there was, how her husband and her walked on the streets to give herbal solutions. Because it looked like with influenza, even with some amount of nourishment, you could kind of survive the disease. And it just so happened that there was such a major drought that the influenza worked on severe malnourishment. And that's why about 20 million people died. It is in fact the greatest, as per Alfred Crosby, the greatest demographic shock arguably ever received by the human species is the influenza pandemic. And the epicenter of that was in India, and the epicenter within India was Central India and Western India, where Lakshmi Bai Tilak lived. So Smriti Chitre now is no longer just an autobiography of a remarkable woman. It gives you 2 important first-person accounts of plague and influenza. And I think that is why it is a remarkable chronicle of also medicine, health, and so on. So again, a chance discovery. And I think there were many such chance discoveries during this writing. Smriti Chitre was probably the biggest one.
Okay. Yeah, it's very vivid. Those excerpts of her book that you have in there, it just jumps out because it is a first-person account, and it's definitely in my reading list. So, you mentioned your mortality database that you put together for this. Can you talk about that a bit? But I mean, what is this and what data is in there?
Yeah, so there are 2 aspects. One is the death counting in India, morbid as such a task can be, started in the 1860s, and partly because in the late 1850s, remember this 1857 uprising, famous uprising in India, which actually happens on the back of a cholera pandemic. And then the early 1860s, there's these severe cholera outbreaks. And the British are really concerned because their soldiers are dying not because of fighting Indians, but because of cholera. And so they say that, enough is enough. We need good statistics to understand death rates. How can we get it down? And so that's the starting point, in a way, of actual public health, I would argue, in many ways, the death counting system. And so they have these sanitary commissioner reports and huge, tables on how many people are dying in how many provinces. And they started it just for the army. And they would have British soldiers and native soldiers. And then they said, let's have it for the whole population. So they made it open. So all the British ruled places of India, we got this mortality statistics. And year on to year, every district of India, basically they have numbers. So what would they say? They would say how many people died and by what cause. And they had six or seven causes. They would have fever, which was a catch-all, usually malaria. They would have diarrhea and dysentery. They would have cholera as a special category. Later on, they had plague. They also had respiratory disease. So that's all we have. We have at the district level, every year from about 1870 to 1940, 70 years data on how did people die. And that's very useful to understand the geography and timing of when how these epidemics spread. And so I basically just got all of this in a spreadsheet. So these are published in sanitary commissioner reports. And I collected a lot of these reports in my archival visits in the past. Because when I would study migration, which is what I studied for the last 10 years, I often went to archives, libraries, and I got a lot of these reports. I mean, as I pointed out, Smriti Chitre, I was sitting on a thing which I saw in the British Library. It's the 1867 report on cholera outbreak in Bombay. Now, there's no need, I never required that report earlier, but I thought it was interesting, and I got it scanned when I was at the British Library because it had some references to migration. But it turned out very useful in this project. So this statistical database, which is actually represented in a side note of the book. The book has a working paper which is freely available online. It's called Pandemics and Historical Mortality in India. So that is the statistical and bibliographic appendix to the book. And I thought I'll put all the charts and tables separately because nobody wants to read a book with charts and tables as for a general audience. And so I thought I'll put that separately and I'll put the text and make a nice narrative out of that. But I'll talk just a bit about because these statistics start only from 1860s, and there's literally nothing on deaths before that. And it turned out that literally 2 days before the lockdown, when I had no clue that I was going to write a book on pandemics, and we're talking about March 2020, I happened to be at the South Park Street Cemetery in Kolkata. And so South Park Street Cemetery is one of the famous cemeteries in India. It's very old. It's very beautiful, actually. Despite being a cemetery, they have these nice monuments inside. And when I went there, at the counter of this cemetery, they have a book of the burial records. And so, like any good person who loves crazy historical data, I bought that book, never knowing that it's going to be so integral for the book project. And so I came back again. I digitized it. I got it on a spreadsheet. And what that book gives you is basically the year of birth and the year of death for about 3,000 people. But because you know the year of death, in each year how many burials there were. And voila, when you put that on the chart, 1817 is the year it jumps up. And so you can argue that, before 1817, mortality was low, and after 18, for the next 30 years, mortality just goes on a plane. And then you can do more with that data. So that was a complete chance discovery. 2 days before the lockdown. If I had come earlier, or the lockdown had happened, I would be stuck in Kolkata and definitely not have written the book. So again, a lot of serendipity in writing this.
Wow, incredible. It's almost as if a lot of these events that we know of about Indian history, like the independence struggle, happened against the backdrop of pandemics, but pandemics also happened against the backdrop of famine and drought. So can you tell us a bit about that, especially with the influenza pandemic? As you point out, India saw 20 million deaths, which is half of the global total. So why was India so disproportionately represented in mortality?
Yeah, it's a big question. My take, there was one, researcher, Ian Mills, and he argued that it's the temperature. So if you see the mortality of influenza, Eastern India and Southern India was spared. It's Western, Central, and Northern India which really got the bulk of mortality. And he had a temperature-based argument. He said that colder climates, influenza often had developed into pneumonic conditions. And so pneumonia is usually found in colder climates. And so he said, because the bulk of the deaths happen in October, November, December, when India gets very cold, especially Northern India. So he had a temperature-based argument. That is, India lost a lot of people because of temperature. But that doesn't work for the whole world. It was very cold, or it was very warm in Africa at that time, but millions of people died in Africa. And so I never found this temperature-based argument convincing. And when you look at the reports, when you look at the chief officer of that time, Norman White, he's very explicit. He said it was about nutrition. He says if people had even a bit of food, they survived it. So if you were well fed, you could survive it. People got it, but you could survive it. But even with half, if you're running on an empty stomach, you would die. So that's sort of a difference. And so the way I got to this drought idea was then looking at the rainfall statistics to show that this drought was not just any other drought. We have droughts, even a few years back we had a drought, but there's an intensity of the drought. And the intensity of the drought of 1918 we're saying, the third worst in the last 150 years. So, and the drought happened literally a few months before, the influenza. So, in one way to look at it is, if influenza had not happened, we would have still had a fair amount of deaths, but maybe not 20 million. But with that influence, with the drought, what happened was prices went through the roof. And so the prices went through the roof only in Western, Central, and Northern India. They didn't go through the roof in Eastern India. In fact, rice prices fell in Bengal, and there was hardly any influenza mortality in Bengal. So the theory I've developed out here is that you have to see the 20 million as influenza plus famine-like conditions, or extreme drought. So it's influenza working on malnutrition, and that kind of explains also Iran, which Amir Afkhami has worked on that. And even he makes a similar argument of nutrition, and I think that's a better explanation of the global cross-country mortality as well as within India mortality. And so that's why the drought is such an important aspect of the peculiarity of this massive toll in India. It just made things much worse.
So I just want to bring in COVID-19 a little bit. And during plague, the government really cracks down. It enacts the Epidemic Diseases Act, which is a draconian law that gives the state immense power to step in, almost like a jailer. And this kind of leads to a question of human rights. And we've seen some of this during COVID. So what should governments do in this situation? Is there a way to balance human rights with the interests of keeping the population safe?
Yeah, this is, big question. And, your wonderful podcast series, which I think all viewers have to watch and listen, which is called, Scrolls and Leaves. It talks a lot about this. That is about surveillance, about how should we clamp borders and so on. The way I look at it, and because I work on migration, let me talk about this in terms of migration, because it brings it very closely. It is a fact that you cannot have a pandemic without some migration, which means you need some people to move to actually create a pandemic, right? Or some migration of either humans, or in the case of plague, the migration of rats. Basically, the vector carrying stuff has to move. It could be either humans or something else. And so the answer from the epidemiologic perspective is very straightforward. To curtail a pandemic, you curtail migration, you curtail mobility, right? And so hence the lockdown. But the more I think people are going to think about this, I don't think this is the simplest answer, so to speak, right? And there are two aspects to this. One is international mobility, and one is internal mobility. And whereas I think you can curtail international mobility, you just shut down airspace and people are stuck wherever they are. And that's how New Zealand got through. That's how Australia got through early on. With internal migration, it's very different. It's almost impossible to curtail internal mobility. And as we saw in India, there was a humanitarian crisis, this whole migration crisis, when the railways were shut down. And I think that came from this hard-nosed epidemiologist view saying, shut down migration. And I think there is a problem with that. And the problem is that you can do it in some classes of migration, but not all classes. And what we saw in India was exactly what the British actually anticipated during the plague, that is people will walk back home. And that's exactly what we saw. People can't fly back home, people can't swim back home, but people can always walk back home within country, because you can't seal state borders. And what we saw in India was, this literally refugee crisis like situation at state borders, and people started running away. You can curtail, because state borders don't have fences, unlike international borders. So the migration crisis of India, according to me, was fairly foreseeable. And in my view, if the pandemic is, and in mid-March, it had still not reached high frequency in India in terms of intensity, I think people should have been allowed the option to go back home before ensuring some sort of a lockdown. And that is why I think you can't have a strict epidemiological kind of view. You have to talk to people who work on migration, have to talk to people who work on human rights, have to talk to people who work in economics, because the other aspect of a strict lockdown is the effect on livelihoods. And in the US, you have unemployment insurance. We don't have that option in India. So people are just going to be unemployed, no incomes. And then what happens is that you are more susceptible to other diseases. Just like 1918 influenza worked on malnutrition. If you fall down the income ladder, you're going to be susceptible to not only COVID, but even a whole other class of diseases. And I think that's what we're going to start seeing in the data this year and the next years, because India has got poorer in the last 1 year. There's been a massive recession. Unfortunately, that opens up the scope for other diseases, not just COVID. So it's a very complex issue, but there's no doubt that some amount of basic human rights have to be. You can't just say shut everything. People who want to go back, give them the option to go back and shut it down after a few days. Right? For example, the UK government, they at least told the international students, they told them 1 week, get out, and then we shut down. That's not what the Indian government did for example, the internal migrant workers. In fact, there was also a sort of a hypocrisy in the response, in the sense the government the locking down of the airspace was much more gradual. And the locking down of the internal space in India was very abrupt, 4 hours notice, and then the railways were shut down. So, to your point, I think some amount of curtailment has to happen, because as we are saying, you cannot have a pandemic without some migration. And so curtailment of pandemics does require some amount of curtailment of migration. But the question is about how do you do it and when do you do it, right? I think it's a given that you have to do it, but that's the critical point.
So a lot of this is about forecasting, right? Forecasting in epidemiology and also in economics. Is there a way to improve forecasting and bring these two different branches of knowledge together? Are there any attempts to do that you're aware of?
I think there's no doubt. Economists and epidemiologists are obsessed about forecasting, right? But as I read in a book, forecasting is inherently extremely difficult, right? In the sense, it is important to forecast, but you're not going to be able to predict 6 months. Economists, we know, the best forecasts in economics in economics work for maximum 6 months to 1 year. Beyond 2 years, beyond 3 years, basically you're as good as flipping a coin, right? I mean, that's the reality of economic forecasting. And similarly, if you saw the projections given for India in March, there were some projections ranging from more than 1 million deaths in a few months. That's not what happened. So in general, whether it's the global financial crisis of 10 years back, where people blamed economics, I think a lot of people are going to be blaming epidemiologists now, saying, you guys over projected the deaths for many countries and under projected the deaths for many. So this is a hard field. And I think the only rational thing to do as a policymaker is to tread some sort of a middle line and just, anticipate. I think New Zealand and these countries, they anticipated that if we shut down now, then we'll be able to open up much quicker than many other countries. And I think that's what UK, for example, is struggling with. But this is no doubt going to be the best or most sought after line of research for the next, many decades. But I'm going to say right now that it is going to be impossible to come up with good forecasting models in either economics or epidemiology. It is very tough to model the interaction of billions of economic transactions or millions of human beings moving around. And so there's always going to be a lot of uncertainty.
So did India get lucky, or have you been just really good at managing COVID? Are there any lessons from the ancient pandemics that can help answer that question in terms of management?
Definitely the fact that we did something compared to influenza where nothing happened, where the trains were diverted for the war purpose, obviously completely different context. But if you see India's position on deaths per capita and economic contraction, which I think the two key variables people are looking at, right? It's not the case that India is one of the best in the world. We're at the bottom half. If you look at 150, 200 countries in the world, we're in the bottom half of how deep our economic contraction is and in terms of deaths per capita. Right? So I wouldn't say we got lucky. In the sense, we might say and this is what I write in the book, it's all about the benchmark. The benchmark we're giving is the US. Right? But if you compare it with Pakistan and Bangladesh, we're doing much worse. Right? So are we saying that Pakistan managed it better than India? And that is why when you look at some of these outcome variables, I think pandemic management is only one part of this whole story. It matters. Or like what I write in the book, it's asymmetric. If there are 1 million deaths or there are 300,000 deaths in the US, high death per capita, you can be rest assured that they didn't do a good job. And if you see what they distrusted science, a lot of things. But if New Zealand had zero, and if Pakistan has a very, very low death per capita, that is no certificate of great pandemic management because there's so many other factors. And to give you an example from the plague of the past, plague ravaged Western and Northern India. It kind of went very light on Eastern and Southern India. And that time they blamed plague on filth and conditions. And yet for 100 years before plague, they had blamed Calcutta precisely for filth and cholera. And yet there was filth, but there was no plague. Right? It's not that the Calcutta people did very different. It's just that the nature of the disease was different. The plague required a particular kind of rat and a particular kind of rat flea for having an efficient transmission. That is why I think we'll get to know only in the next few years exactly what is COVID, right? Exactly how it transmits. And then we'll realize that actually not all countries were at the same risk level. Now, I don't think it'll be a mistake to then look back, at that point, say 3 years down the line and say, then why did we do such a harsh lockdown and so on? I think that was a right call in that context. That is, you're still taking precautions because you don't know what could happen later on. But obviously, we are very happy that the number is not 1 million deaths; it's at 150,000. It's still painful, but while writing this book, I mean, when I was writing about influenza in this book, at that time in India, our number scorecard was about 100,000 deaths, and 200,000 people in India died on a single day of November 1918. That's the kind of horrendous mortality that happened in the past. So relative to the past, we are much better, and we have learned that we have to take early actions. But there are also huge lessons in terms of how do we manage certain things like migration, right? And I think there are important lessons from the past that we should have allowed our migrant workers to go back home and then enforce the lockdown, which I had written an op-ed piece at the time of the lockdown. Unfortunately, they didn't do that, and 2 months later, they had to send back. They were forced to send the migrant workers back at a time when the infection rates were much higher. Right? So it kind of defeated the whole point of not letting people go back to spread the virus and so on. So that's the important learning. It's not that India has done very well or very badly, somewhere in the middle. But the migration crisis was completely unnecessary. And I think a learning of the past is that this was completely foreseeable, completely avoidable.
Sure. And just a philosophical question, perhaps. What lessons should we take away from the age of pandemics for how we should live on the planet and coexist with other species?
Yeah, I mean, one way to look at this whole thing is that, if you see the debates on pandemics over the past, it has always been economics versus epidemiology. These things that we're seeing today in terms of lockdown and so on have always been there. The word for lockdown would be quarantine during cholera. Today's world, we have an added dimension of the environment. So from the two E's of economics and epidemiology, now we have this third E, which is the environment. And I think those brief glimpses of the lockdown showed us actually how dramatic and an impact a complete lockdown can make. That is, there were jokes in India. You can now see the Himalayas from many towns in North India because quality of air had improved so much and so on. And I think that's the kind of learning that is, a lot of people are saying everyone wants to go back to normal, but that normal was, a very carbon intensive normal, which was in a way causing this other great crisis of climate change and so on. And so from that perspective, actually it is us, the human beings, which are the greatest pandemic. In the sense, if you look at what is a pandemic, it causes mass mortality. If you look at from the perspective of other species, it is us who are kind of destroying, the world. And so you can call it like an anthropocentric, pandemic of some sort. And so the real takeaway then is that, we need to start really taking, not once the pandemic recedes, there is still a larger crisis, what we call as climate change and so on, which needs to be tackled. And I think the pandemic actually gave a peek into what is possible. Right? Is it possible to go on days of the week where nobody's using, a private transport? Is it possible to completely? Is it possible to even, imagine working from home on a greater basis so that you're cutting down again on carbon consumption? So I think these are the kind of things that I would take away for sure about how to live in a more sustainable manner going forward.
I just want to remind the viewers that if you have any questions, just enter it in the Q&A box at the end, and I'll just read them out. I think right now, down to questions. So I wanted to also ask you, just following on with that, from that question. So on a personal level, how has your life changed during the pandemic? Are there things you think you'll do differently? Are there sort of like behavior changes that you think will result from COVID-19?
For me, on a personal level? Or,
yes, on a personal level.
I don't know. So I should, state that I live a very privileged existence, on a lovely university campus. And, in a sense, I don't think the pandemic has really changed much for me. Obviously, we kind of miss travel. So we are all saying once it's over, we're going to travel more and so on. But I don't know. I mean, I think it's been, I don't think it's changed fundamentally. I got the opportunity to read a lot and much more than usual. And I think that's one habit I'm taking into this year, that cut down on my visual consumption of, these soaps and series and so on, and read more. So that's definitely, one learning. But beyond that, I don't own a car. So, anyway, not into the automotive world. Beyond that, not so much, yeah. But let me ask you, how has it changed you?
Well, I have not traveled the past year, so that's huge. And I feel good about it because finally I'm not contributing to carbon emissions. Other than that, I think I'm just gonna be less of a consumer, buy less stuff, and do things like thrift, recycle, reuse, all those good things that our parents did, and we used to make fun of them when we were kids, like, why are you washing that plastic bag and reusing it like that Ziploc bag? But I see value in that. So I think, well, let's see how long it goes.
Yeah.
I see Q&A. There is a comment from Yoshita. Not a question, but love the metal bookshelf in the age of wooden bookshelves. Reminded me of my college school library.
Yeah, this is actually, again, since we started this conversation through libraries, The building I'm in, it's actually, so our main, faculty office block has gone for a restoration because it's the Louis Kahn structure. And so we've been given new offices, but so what happened was they restored the library first, and now they're restoring the faculty offices wing. And so this place where I'm sitting right now was the makeshift library. And so when I moved out here, they had tons of these library stacks out here. And I said, hey, hang on, I love them and I want them here. So these ought to have been in the library, but I said, no, keep it. So I don't own them personally. These are library stacks. But I agree completely, with the comment that I think they look really great. And it gives a very different feel in the room.
Yeah, it belongs in a library, definitely. So, one question I had was, we have forgotten about these pandemics. I was asking my mom the other day, and she said when she was a kid, her grandmother used to speak about these fevers, and this was like 1920s, and this 3-day fever would come and it would just take people away, and it was terrible. So why have we forgotten?
The pandemics, right? I mean, yeah, I think a simple answer is that it happened so long ago, right? And there was no proper documentation. The 20 million deaths that happened under the influenza pandemic, the only government response was in February, March 1919, and it was a 10-page document called A Preliminary Report on the 1918 influenza pandemic, and the final report never came, right? And we're talking about 20 million deaths. So there was no documentation. There's been no commemoration. And because our understanding of history in India has been basically political history, and if you ask Indians what happened in the 19th and 20th century, it's all about British rule, right? And so what I learned actually in this while writing is that even the British were dying in spectacularly large, high mortality rates. So one way to look at this whole period is, especially until the late 19th century, is that it's not Indians and British fighting each other. The biggest enemy for both was infectious disease, right? And when you start seeing it that way, you realize that actually a lot of the actions are just trying to keep diseases at bay. So from the day-to-day perspective and experience of people, it was not so much about British, humiliation, or from the British perspective, Indians attacking. It was just how do we survive, And so this kind of thing has lost out in our overall political narrative of, the British exploiting India, or Indian uprisings against the British and so on. And it's best, seen about the influenza. 1919 is this famous, Jallianwala Bagh massacre, infamous rather, in April. And Indians, we all know about this. Jallianwala Bagh tragedy is well enshrined in our collective memory. And this, killed maybe a few hundred, maybe 1,000 people. And yet the months leading up to this tragedy, 20 million Indians died. And nobody really knows about this. If you think about Gandhi, Gandhi's rise happens, I would argue, because of influenza, in the sense it happens exactly as these deaths are happening, and it's complete despair, and he becomes this national hero. And yet people have not really seen pandemics as the launching pad of many people, right? And so one sort of way to look at this book is some of the famous political events of Indian history should actually be anchored to pandemics. So 1857 uprising to the cholera pandemic, the rise of figures like Tilak, Gokhale, Sardar Patel, all of them, their rise is through the plague pandemic, and then the rise of Gandhi through the influenza pandemic, and such important markers of the freedom movement. But when we learn about the freedom movement in India, we learn about fighting the British. It's not about fighting infectious disease. And so so in terms of why we've forgotten, the political narrative has overridden everything else. Right? And so this period of Indian history is about, compare with European history, where people know about the Black Death. Black Death as an event has been enshrined. Why? It had a massive impact on demography in Europe. It has been written about. There was artwork on it. And so arguably that collective memory of that event has been much stronger in Europe. And when I was researching this, amazing, when British officials are encountering plague in the 19th century, they are talking about the Black Death, right? They are in the 19th century, they know what happened 600 years back, 500 years back. And yet we are here in 2020 and we don't know, what happened 100 years back. And that was the real trigger point of writing the book. When I took stock of the situation in March, said to myself, I had been working a bit on influenza and plague and cholera, of course, David Arnold has a book, and people have written on plague and cholera at some length. But I thought nobody has really put all of this as a real era of pandemics which rocked the subcontinent and many other parts of the world. And so this book is in a way precisely for that. That the fact that the question that you asked, why have we forgotten, is because one reason is there's been no book on it. There's really been no one sort of book connecting the dots for all these three major pandemics. The political narrative has overridden, and epidemics compared to wars or even famines or earthquakes, the other class of mass mortality, are in a way, let's say, less sexy in the sense, they don't have a clear enemy, right? So in the case of war, there's a clear enemy, the British, for example, or World War II. We know a lot about World War II because there's clear enemies, battle lines drawn. But with infectious disease, who's the enemy, right? So I think multiple reasons, but the main reason is we've not had a major pandemic after 1920, right? And in a way, we just got lucky. And it's precise. If you see the global distribution today, there is a case to be made that countries which have controlled COVID well were precisely those countries which had an exposure to a recent pandemic, mainly SARS or swine flu. So much of East Asia knew how to deal with these things. And that is why they got lucky, because there's recent memory. The only part of India which had recent memory was Kerala. They had to deal with the Nipah virus outbreak of 2018. And no wonder Kerala was on top of the game, right from start. In fact, India had to wait till March before it accepted the WHO, wording of pandemic and so on. Kerala from Jan itself had started screening people and so on. Why? Because they knew that these things can happen. So recency bias, that is, if if the memory is still alive, people take stronger actions. So for us to, and that is why it's important to archive the present. It's important, for example, what you're doing right now with podcast is fantastic. Because I think, 50, 100 years down the line, people are going to listen to this and say, this happened at that particular moment. And we might think that now, how can we forget this experience and so on? But unless people start writing about it, unless there's a government task force on it, we will very quickly lose a lot of this material or a lot of our experiences of today. So if we were going to have this conversation 100 years later, in 2001, 21, it is possible that people would not have known COVID. And something unimaginable now, right? We think that this is the most important thing to have happened in our generations. But it's quite possible that if it's not been enshrined in the transfer of knowledge from one generation to another, that in 21, if there's a pandemic, we'll still arguably shut down the railways with a 4-hour notice period, and we'll still get a migration crisis. And so that is why collective memory is very important. And that's the strongest message of the book, is we not only need to know this event, it needs to be taught in medical schools in particular, and also that we need to understand our own present in a much more systematic manner.
Fair enough. There is one question from an anonymous attendee. Do you think certain countries have had an advantage in handling a pandemic better because of cultural differences? Example, bowing, mosque culture in Japan, Korea, as opposed to the hugging, greeting culture?
It's a nice way to look at it. I mean, a lot of people in India, talk about the namaste as also a classic, response. A lot of theorization that namaste itself emerged because of some past epidemics as a way of social distancing, basically. Quick answer is no. I don't think so. In the sense, I don't think these kind of cultural differences matter. For the simple reason that we have seen this spread happening in many countries of the world, and for the simple reason that what we're talking about is namaste or bowing and many other things, they've been there for a long time, and these countries had pandemics in the past, right? So in the sense, we had the namastes, but we had 20 million people dead in influenza in 1918, right? And I'm pretty sure they were doing namaste back then. Or people were bowing in Korea and Japan, but Japan was knocked out by cholera in the 19th century. So I think what you're taking off is an interesting hypothesis, and that is why history is useful, to test the hypothesis against different sort of episodes. And I should just point out that cultural differences, people nowadays downplay cultural differences in explaining economic phenomena, variety of things. just to build on to what you're saying, like Max Weber famously said, India is poor because India lacked the Protestant ethic, right? And this was a big reason to understand why some countries of the world are poorer than the rest. But today, few people would argue that culture matters in that sense. So like in economic history, I don't think even in epidemic history, these sort of cultural differences matter. As I said, I think it is a recency bias. That is, East Asia knew how to deal with epidemics because of the recent past, because they had SARS and swine flu in quick succession in the last 20 years. That is the only explanation I can sort of think of. The other part is what we don't know. In the next few years, we're going to learn a lot more of COVID, which we don't know now. And it could be that some body types are more immune. We don't know as of now, right? What is the full story? And so one has to be just patient and sort of a bow in humility that we don't know too much.
Yeah, it reminds me of what you said about the rat flea and how they figured out it's the seasonality of the rat flea and its presence that dictated the spread of plague. So definitely feels like there's some sort of an X factor with COVID that we don't fully understand. So on that note, I think we can conclude. So as you write, this book is about reviving our public memory of these pandemics, and I think it definitely does that. So thank you for sharing your knowledge, and to our listeners, thank you so much for being here. And just a reminder that this book is available on Champaca, www.champaca.in, and it ships across India.
I'd just like to add that Champaca is a wonderful bookstore. And so if you go to Bengaluru, you have to go there. And I have a very fond memory of my previous book talk on migration at the bookstore. And it's very unfortunate that we couldn't have it there this time. But I'd also like to thank HarperCollins and Champaca for organizing this event. And it's been wonderful to talk to you, Gayathri. And for all the viewers, do watch out for Scrolls and Leaves, which is a fantastic podcast series run by Gayathri and others. Thank you.
Thank you, Chinmay.